While Valerie, yeah, I'll switch. um, okay, so I am going to actually talk from my experience. I have a couple of slides prepared, but I will switch to those when I get to that point. But I want to say that I'm extremely honored to be invited and to join a very important conversation. Actually, my experience with Yerevan has been very interface driven and data driven. So my first visit was in 2014 when I conducted a series of workshops at TUMO, and since then I went back a few more times to continue conducting workshops. And my research is quite interdisciplinary, and each time I try to bring a piece of that back to the city and try to think about ways that we can ultimately trigger sociospatial dynamics. So I'm trained as an architect. My focus since very beginning was on computational design. I was always interested in thinking about automating process while thinking about the creative and the subjectivity of the designer. As I graduated from Columbia University in 2010, this was the year where a lot of terms such as big data were thrown around, and a lot of new departments in different universities like spatial science and data science were being introduced. So the big question right in the midst of the crisis for me was, how can architecture start to adopt data-driven workflows to then begin to conduct better decisions? I've always been interested in actually non-architecture scale, and it's quite difficult to define scale in architecture. I tend to always gravitate toward smaller scale or really large scale. So eventually I begin to teach and conduct research in the city scale. And a very big component of this has been also starting to think about interdisciplinary thinking. So along the way, I began a PhD program in School of Cinematic Arts. So cinematic arts has always had a very interesting relationship to architecture. As architects, designers, city makers, urban planners, thinkers, creative bunch, we've always been drawn to image making and also image manipulation. So it was a very interesting experience for me to begin to question some of the investigations that I was doing under umbrella of School of Cinematic Arts with a focus on immersive media and interactive media. So since then, my focus has shifted to ultimately thinking about interface design. And this is quite, I would say the scale is quite larger than maybe the way that a lot of generic UI designers perhaps will think about interface. But here I would like to actually take this opportunity and with you here suggest maybe an alternative definition for interface, or maybe rethinking this concept of interface. So I'm going to share my screen and propose here a way of rethinking about this concept of interface. So interface, currently, if you're thrown this word, maybe you're starting to think about computer interfaces, maybe you're starting to think about even certain blocks in computer science, which are using this term interface. But if you come from an architecture and design background, an urban planning background, if somebody tells you an interface, perhaps you would start to think about a door as an interface. You would start to think about maybe the meeting point between two surfaces, two materials, between an indoor and outdoor as an interface. So for me, it's always been really interesting to think about maybe merging the two together. So if we were to simplify concept of an interface as a meeting point of two systems, or as a meeting point of a system with an environment, then perhaps we can have a more open definition of this and think about maybe scaling up the design for architecture and urban purposes in a very different way. I'm going to go back to actually my first experience being in Yerevan. In 2014, while I was roaming the city with a few of the friends on Pushkin Street, there were a series of protests that were trying to pretty much turn over heritage construction that was happening. And for me, it was very interesting, kind of being thrown into and joining a protest of this sort and this scale, and look at the passion and drive of especially the youth and the population and their reaction towards what the city was actually doing with the new planning and design decisions for the city. What was also very interesting walking around the city was a lot of the new proposals. So these were often elements that were going to be turned down and also built back, often replaced with the really, really horrible definition of what you would call with the capital A architecture. They were replaced with series of images, with sometimes a printed banner that would temporarily make you feel better, that there was temporarily a memory of a trace of a surface or an interface before. And this is a very common practice, especially you see this quite a lot in cities like Rome or Paris, where heritage conservation is quite important. And you do see these kind of temporary surfaces or interfaces replacing the new and the old. The other experiences of my city were conducting workshops that were about environmental data collection. So I was teaching a course at AUA in summer of 2017, where we were walking around the city and collecting quite a lot of data that was then turned into GIS layers. And then we began to analyze different environmental conditions of the city. So I've always had a very, I would say, digital and very, I would say, interface-based relationship with the city of Yerevan. Also, partially that comes from the fact that when you're visiting a city for the first time and you're not familiar with the alleys and the back spaces, then it takes you a very long time. And currently, navigation applications, how maybe engaging or how maybe static they are the way that you are finding your way around the city. So I've always been interested in thinking about also ways that we can start to encourage participation. So a city like Yerevan is extremely active. People have opinions about everything. And it's quite exciting to start to think about maybe alternative ways of responding to changes in the city through community making and by looking at common goods. I know that there's really incredible efforts currently happening with a series of projects and hackathons that are happening there. So it's been extremely encouraging to see these efforts going forward. So this slides here, these are a few images that I captured from visiting Venice Biennale in 2012. And I would say this was the first time where this concept of common goods and community building was brought into a large exhibition, I would say, venue like this. There were a lot of good components that came out of an exhibition of this sort. Certainly a lot of different countries, they highlighted their efforts, they looked at ways that modes of community building, and a lot of them also using media, interactive media, can start to think about ways that we could enhance our relationship to the city. But I would say this exhibition also failed in a certain sense, that really people that were initially interested in questions of community building, questions of engagements, had a high regard for the work that were created here, but people were not interested in or not engaged with these topics as well. They completely wrote this off. So this is a very common problem. So maybe for friends that when I was in Yerevan in 2014 went to that Pushkin Street protest are the same ones that are participating here, are the same ones that are going to over and over engage with this initiative. So I guess the question is, how can we start to expand the efforts further and begin to think about ways that the general public, the person that's so occupied with their day-to-day battles, is also interested in this type of initiatives. And ultimately, how we can collectively think about better city making and space making. So this is a very interesting project. And for those of you architects, this is a very familiar project. So this was a competition proposal by Bernard Tschumi, who was the Dean of Columbia University for a very long time. And it was quite revolutionary in the way that it defines space making and also interaction. So this project has quite a lot of significance in many levels. So one of its main significance is the fact that it started to think about system design. It started to think about layering information, and started to think about coding or decoding architectural features, urban features, infrastructure, in a way that ultimately becomes a way for people to discover these spaces, to become engaged with the spaces. So this system was consisted of a grid. So these were 10 meter by 10 meter folies, and then a path between which Bernard Tschumi in this case called it the serpentine path. And these were the intersections, the unexpected paths and the accidents that would ultimately allow people to think about these moments of discovery, these moments of curiosity, and what he ultimately coined as this term called designing for event spaces. So Bernard Tschumi since has spent a lot of time defining this concept of event spaces. He has quite a lot of significance to me because I studied in a university where he had designed the student center. So ultimately, I lived these theoretical concepts of event making. Also, currently, I'm teaching in Florida International University, where the School of Architecture is designed by Bernard Tschumi. So I've spent way too much time, perhaps, thinking about this concept of event spaces, and it's something that, as I'm walking out of my office daily and thinking about the intersection, geometrical, material, this is something that really occupies my mind. But the truth is that these spaces are quite unfriendly, and I am an architecture enthusiast. I'm a very big fan of his work, and I cherish being in these spaces. But the general public did not, unfortunately, have the same response to these to Parc de la Villette. So for many critics, this park is actually a failure. And the big reason for this is the management. So along the way, the utopian dream of Tschumi kind of disappeared, and the bureaucratic process of maintaining a park of this scale kind of took better of the project, and it basically deteriorated. A lot of the folies were closed, and this event space became a non-event space. And for a very long time, this was a source of curiosity, and it was very, very exciting to see that with the advent of Pokemon Go, the space completely changed. So I'm sure you're all familiar with Pokemon Go. I'm sure you're all maybe played it in some capacity, or you've been annoyed by people that have played this. But it was very, very fascinating to think about the conjunction of Parc de la Villette with this augmented reality application, which was proposed by a company in San Francisco called Niantic. And Niantic started off by, for many years, they were trying to really create engaging or social applications, interactive applications. And the CEO and CTOs of companies, they were quite well known in the field of interactive media production. It was a very, very important point where after the release of Ingress and the momentum that it gained, that they completely started to think about another way of engaging the city. Obviously, this was in parallel with a lot of advancements that happened in mobile devices. But all of it together, it was a very, very crucial moment in the field of immersive media development, interactive media development, participatory urbanism, and a lot of maybe old questions were brought up again, because for a very long time, this was thought as not possible. Obviously, I'm sure you've heard stories of people walking into a lake, maybe falling off a cliff, being so occupied with the game. But if you just look at how the park on the right side has been has changed, and these are part of that serpentine path, it's extremely exciting to see how overlaying of media, in this case interactive media, could start to completely change sociospatial dynamics of our cities. It will be very interesting to start to compare scale. Unfortunately, we're not there yet, but there's incredible amount of efforts that are being done. I know there's some efforts done in Armenia and also globally. I'm currently working on a social media based air quality application. It's like Pokemon Go, but for environmental issues. And it's very interesting to see how, again, mechanisms that was developed by this game and this company could start to revolutionize the way that we're thinking about cities and data. Obviously, issues of privacy, user profiles, demographics, and is very important, but I think perhaps we can separate that for now. But just because you have a geolocation-based application, whether it's augmented reality or whether it's more of a mobile-based game, it doesn't mean that actually people are going to continue engaging with this. So for gamification, and gamification is a term that currently there's a lot of debate over the term and over the well, it's over the coining the term, but also over the usage of the term, because some people think that it's really overused. But let's just go with the term gamification. And for you to be able to gamify a system, you ultimately need incentive creation. And incentive creation is basically the beginning of how we can think about even economy. So for also an incentive creation to have momentum, for it to continue, and for it to engage people over time, there's four main criteria. So the first criteria is entertainment. If your application from beginning is not entertaining enough, if it doesn't kind of pass the first maybe the cute test or the first maybe interaction test, then you're not going to be able to sustain participation and ultimately incentivize people. The second thing is research. So if people are interested in doing research, then they will engage with this, whether your application is entertaining enough or not. The third component is activism. So I brushed on this slightly. So same people that are going to go to protests for, let's say, heritage destruction that's happening in Yerevan, they're going to over and over again show up to the same places. So perhaps if you have an application that's targeting this group, could begin to also engage these people. And the last component is monetization. So if there is a monetization component, which we can begin to see how these applications are going towards there, then definitely this could be a way to go around this. So I am running out of time, so I want to just open some time for questions. This was more about kind of demonstrating some of the common threads that may be occupying the space of research of people that are starting to think about overlaying of media with cities. Again, thinking about going back to this term interface, I initially said that interface, depending on the discipline you come from, it could be interpreted in a very different way. So if we go back to maybe more of an architectural and urban scale, if we go back to the way that, for instance, I in undergrad was taught that a door is an interface, how can then use of this locative media, this interactive media, could also begin to engage the built space? One last comment. I don't believe that all old buildings should be preserved. So I think there's a lot of good that over time in cities get preserved. But also, architecture has this very strange lifespan. Currently, the type of generic buildings that we live in, they go between this maybe older lifespan and more of a quick turnaround lifespan. Maybe we need to separate also our idea of temporality in cities. So can we start to think about certain components, certain landmarks, certain spaces, certain interfaces more as a long-term components of the city, and perhaps the day-to-day architecture more as a shorter term. This is more of something that occupies my mind, and I'll be curious to start a conversation with whoever's interested in engaging. Thank you so much for the opportunity.